Hi, everybody. This week we're going to move back to Chapter 3 and we're going to talk a little bit about ethics in research. I will admit this is a pretty straightforward chapter for us to look at. So let's move on and we'll talk a little bit about what this chapter has to offer us and think about how it can impact our research or future research. So when we think about ethics in terms of nutritional research, today we're going to start by doing a little bit of introduction. We will look at the history of research ethics a little bit and some of its background, the reason that it's so important to us today. We're going to talk about the responsible conduct of research. We'll look at ethics and human subject research, which of course is something that we're definitely going to see in a lot of our nutritional research. And then we'll talk finally about institutional review boards and what that means for you and for research within college and university institutions. So when we think about ethics in research, we want to think about the norms for conduct and describing acceptable and unacceptable behavior, right? In terms of what is appropriate and how we approach our research. We want our research at the end of the day to be valid. We want to do the right thing, and we want to make sure that we don't have any bias when we're doing the research. So there's a lot of things that are going to come into this. And you've probably seen research in the past where you question whether something is biased, right? If we are going to see research coming from Philip Morrow that tells us that cigarettes are not bad for us, we know there's probably some bias that went into whatever research might have happened there. So it's always important that we look at who's doing the research and is there an outcome that they might be looking for, right? What did that research look like? Why was it done? How was it done? Again, this goes back to one of the reasons that we do peer-reviewed, right? So peer-reviewed is going to help ensure that we don't have the biases when we do the research, that we unpack our biases as we talk about what we're trying to do. So there's lots of ways we can look at ethics in terms of the research process itself, making sure that we're not harming others. So we'll talk about that as we move forward a little bit today. So ethical standards in research should promote knowledge and avoid errors in the pursuit of knowledge. So part of that is making sure that we are doing the right thing and that we are not including bias in what we're doing. Ethics standards in research should promote collaborative work among researchers who are often from different disciplines and different institutions. There's an advantage to having multiple researchers to bring in the resources from more than one place when we're doing research. Ethical norms in research help keep researchers accountable to the public. The way in which we do our research, the process that we use, making it ethical both in terms of honesty as well as making sure that we are treating our subjects appropriately. And then norms in promoting human values, human rights, right? Being in compliance with regulations. It's not just about compliance. It should never be about compliance. It should be about doing the right thing every time, right? That's a whole nother conversation that we can have about ethics. But at the end of the day, compliance is the last reason we should be doing things. So today we want to talk about our research participants, right? Our research participants are protected. Our human subjects, our children's, all of our subjects through ethical guidelines, making sure that we are following appropriate and ethical guidelines. We'll get to that in a moment. Informed consent. It's very important that anybody that is involved in a research study knows what they have agreed to sign on to. What are the potential dangers in their research that might be done? What are the potential pitfalls? What can they expect in the process? And as we talk about informed consent, it's also really important that participants, our study participants, recognize or know that they can back out at any time. So just because they start the process doesn't mean they have to finish it. Can this impact your final results? Yes. But it's the ethical and the right thing to do. We'll talk about what that looks like again in a moment. And then finally, we're going to talk about an institutional review board, IRB. The IRB review having other practitioners and professionals approve the work that you're going to do before you do it. And we'll talk about who has IRB boards, who has the IRBs, and where you might need that. So when we look at the history of ethics in research, it's sad that we have to have the conversation to begin with. We really start with the Nuremberg Code of 1949. And as a result of the Nuremberg Code, we have established that subjects must be voluntarily consent to be in the study. That means that we are choosing participants that want to be in the study. This means we can't force people to be in a study. And this comes from a history where researchers would, unethically of course, would look at a population and say that's an unimportant population and they have no voice or no choice. And they would force them. Think about prisoners. Prisoners being forced to be part of a research study, right? Homeless, being forced to be part of a research study. So as a result of this, since 1949, subjects must voluntarily consent to the study. They have the right to stop participating at any point, which is especially important when we're dealing with human subjects, right? So we might be looking at, let's say it's a medical study. Let's say it has to do with a new drug, a new pill, whatever that is. If that drug is resulting in uncomfortable side effects for individuals, it would be inappropriate to force them to finish the study and just say, oh, it's fine. You're going to have a migraine for the next 6 months. Just go ahead, right? There are other things that could impact that individual. So they have to have the right to stop participating at any time. And they have to be fully aware that they have that right. So informed consent is not, do you want to be in the study? But here's everything that's going to happen. Here's what could go wrong. Here's what to expect. And by the way, if anything happens that you're uncomfortable, you can back out. Subjects should be protected from unnecessary physical and mental suffering and injury, disabilities, and certainly death, right? So when we look at medical studies, we're going to talk in a little bit about different levels of care that we might offer. Ignoring someone is not an acceptable level of care, right? Even though you want two different control group, you want a control group and you want an intervention group, the control group might not be nothing. It might be existing care as opposed to the new type of intervention, the new type of care, right? Because we don't want something to lead to disability or death. The benefits of the study should outweigh the costs. Why are we doing the study and what can we learn from that, right? And the Nuremberg Code was obviously the basis for what we're doing moving forward. It came about as a result of the Nuremberg trials, right? Things that were done, war atrocities, where prisoners were basically used as human guinea pigs, not acceptable. So we've moved forward from that, which allows for the informed consent. Around that same time, we also looked at the Declaration of Helsinki. Medical research with vulnerable groups should only be done if it would benefit the health needs of the group, and the research cannot be carried out on other groups who are not vulnerable. So we don't just arbitrarily choose children or homeless to do studies on, right? There needs to be a reason. So children with a particular disease can certainly be part of a study because we know that we're trying to cure a particular disease, right? Homeless, if there's a particular disease that is unique to a homeless population, then yes, it makes sense for that population to participate in that, but not to have vulnerable populations participate in a study that is not directly related to that particular population, right? And we certainly, again, have to have the informed consent. This is still used by physicians, by institutions around the world today, is we don't do tests, we don't do studies on vulnerable populations unless it is the only way, and we have that informed consent that we are going to be able to get better information and improve lives in the future. We move on to the 1970s, right? The Belmont Report. The Belmont Report takes us a step further, defining ethical principles for research, including respect for persons. So respecting the people, not looking at them as just a guinea pig. We've already said we need informed consent. Now we go to this next level of helping them to understand how and why. Benefits. Individuals in the study should not be harmed, and we should minimize harms and maximize potential benefits. And this is one of those times when we want to look at our research through a social justice lens. Are we negatively impacting vulnerable populations? Are we negatively impacting vulnerable individuals when we're doing our studies? And when we look at the studies, I gave the example of trying to make sure that we were giving care. So if you've got, for example, a new cancer treatment, you don't have a control group that gets no treatment and then an intervention group that gets the newest form of chemotherapy. Instead, the option there is current or existing treatment. So your control group would get the existing chemotherapy, right? And then your new group is going to get the control, or your new group is going to get the intervention. The intervention is going to be the new chemo or the new medication or the new whatever it is. But we don't go with, here's a new product and nothing. We go with new product versus old treatment method, right? When we have an existing treatment method, so that we can see, does the new treatment perform better than the existing treatment? Not is the new treatment just better than nothing, if that makes sense, okay? So we want to make sure that we're still thinking about our individuals and making sure their needs are met. We also talked briefly about the Common Rule. The Common Rule is part of the Code of Federal Regulations, Title 45, Part 46, Subpart A, whatever, known as the Common Rule or Federal Policy for Protecting Human Subjects. In reality, what you're looking at when we talk about that is there are 16 different departments or federal agencies that are overseeing studies. So the Common Rule has procedures to protect human subjects, including guidelines to ensure compliance with research institutions or by research institutions, to secure document information and consent, right? How are we getting the consent? Does the person fully understand what they are consenting to, right? You cannot have someone sign a consent form that is mentally unable to understand it, right? Minors themselves cannot legally sign a consent form. That's up to their parents, right? And it's up to the researcher and the doctor in many of those studies to ensure that they are doing no harm to a participant. Even if somebody else has consented for a child, the doctor or the researcher needs to also be a secondary guard to say, no, we need to stop what we're doing, or this isn't appropriate for this individual. The guidelines also secure document and informed consent. I said that already. Making sure that our documents are protected, right? We have FERPA laws. We have to make sure, especially when we're dealing with medical tests, that this information does not get out to other individuals, other insurance companies, right? So we want to make sure that all of our data is secure and safe. The guidelines also are guides to our IRB operations, institutional review boards. So before any human subject is in a study, the study design is approved and all of the documents are approved by an institutional review board. Now, hospitals, universities, major research institutions all have an IRB process where existing researchers, board, whatever that is, however that works in that institution, will review the plan for the research, the intended methodology. They will then look at all of the documentation and they will look at the forms and the protocols that are intended to be used. So you have to have very detailed protocols about what happens in any situation, right? If we are having a blood draw, there are additional requirements in terms of protocols that have to be approved and identified before IRB would be approved, right? and to protect vulnerable research participants, as I've already said. So these are some of the things that the common rule, that the government, that we're looking at to ensure. And these should be no-brainers, right? We want to protect our human subjects. So, responsible conduct of research. We want to practice scientific investigation with integrity. That involves the awareness and application of established professional norms and ethical principles in the performance of all activities related to research. How do we develop our questions? How do we develop our protocols? How do we interact with our individuals? How do we ask our questions? How do we send out our flyers or our questionnaires or whatever it is that we're doing? Are we doing it in good practice? Are we doing it with integrity? And are we making sure that we are protecting our vulnerable populations through this process, right? So that we get trustworthy and good data at the end. So what that might include or be related to: policies regarding human subjects, live vertebrate animals in research, safe laboratory practices, all of that requires that we're following good ethical standards. Mentoring and mentee relationships and responsibilities. It is always good practice with researchers to have researchers of different experiences and levels so that we are training and mentoring new researchers along the way. Is there any conflict of interest? We want to be aware of conflicts of interest, personal, professional, or financial. And anytime there's a potential conflict of interest, we want to identify that in writing. So we're going to say, when we write an article, if somebody paid for that research, who paid for it? Is there an expected outcome, right? We're probably not going to take on a research study for Philip Morris that's going to come back and say, oh, cigarettes really don't cause harm, and think that it's not going to hurt our reputation. We want to be ethical in the process and know that there's no bias going into the research design or the outcomes. Collaborative research includes collaborating within industry, right? What are some best practices with industry? This also means peer review. Very important that we have peers review our study both before, so that they help us to identify that we have appropriate methods in place and practices, as well as after. Did we do everything right? Data acquisition and management. How did we get the data? Who was our population? How did we get to that population, right? And as a result of our access to the population, were people left out? So did we get good, valid data? We also want to think about research misconduct and policies for handling misconduct. If somebody cherry picks information, we know, many of us, from previous experiences, from conversations with our math teachers, from looking at data, the data can be manipulated or cherry picked, and people like to do this. They like to take the one study or the one calculation that is different from others and focus on an outlier, right? Outliers often exist. They don't tell a story. So making sure that we are choosing and interpreting our data properly. Okay? And we think about the responsibility of the authors in the publications to write accurately. So conflicts of interest. There's three basic types of conflicts of interest. The conflict between private interests and the official or professional relationships of a person and in a position of trust. So we might be looking at a financial conflict, right? The financial conflict is an easy one to understand. Thinking about who's paying for that research, was there an expectation of an outcome that came with that? If they're not happy with the research, what's the outcome going to be? So is there a financial conflict? Is there a conflict of commitment? When I think about a conflict of commitment, this happens often, can happen, should not, can happen in educational institutions, right? Where a researcher is being paid by multiple organizations. So where is your commitment? Is your commitment with the university? Is your commitment with the professional organization that's hired you? Who's paying the salary? Who's paying for the research itself? And trying to maintain that differentiation and that separation so that we don't have that conflict of commitment. Who am I committed to? Who is the research actually for? Personal and intellectual conflicts, right? I don't want to go into a research situation where I have an extreme bias, where I'm expecting a particular outcome, and I allow that bias to seep its way into the way that I design my research. You can design research to find specific outcomes, right? So again, that manipulating data. Did we pick the data that told us only what we wanted to? Did we ignore the other data that we might have received and only published part of that that might refute the outcome that we wanted or that we really got? So personal and intellectual conflicts would be another type of conflict that you might see. That's pretty significant when you are not sharing the true outcome because you want to skew what the research says. So, research misconduct. Misconduct refers to the fabrication, falsification, or plagiarism in processing, performing, or reviewing research, or in reporting research results, and it does not include honest error or differences of opinion. So let's be really careful here. There's been a lot of public conversation about plagiarism in the last couple of years. Educational researchers in particular have been accused of plagiarism by people that do not understand what research is. So as we talked about writing a research proposal, as we talked about writing a literature review, I mentioned in a previous lecture, you've not had an original thought. So you give credit to others. When you go to turn in your lit review and it goes through a plagiarism checker, right? It goes through Turn Me In. It's quite possible that I will get very high percentages that it is plagiarized or that you've copied something. Yes, but you've cited it. And as long as you have cited everything that's in there, that's not plagiarism. Plagiarism is taking somebody else's work and not giving credit. Good academic scientific research is based on the work of others and then moving forward. So as long as you have significant citations, that is not plagiarism. That is pulling together the research data and knowledge in a particular topic that we already have and verifying and sharing it again. So I hope that makes sense. Plagiarism is not an issue when you are properly citing everything that's going in there. I hope that makes sense. It's a fine line to walk, but it's very frustrating as a researcher to be blamed of plagiarism when you have in fact given credit to all of the folks that wrote the original work. So just be aware of what that really looks like. I am more concerned about the fabrication or falsification of data that you were then presenting later on. So fabrication, the making up of data or results and recording it or reporting them, right? So just making stuff up. I didn't actually do the study. Falsification is manipulating the materials, equipment, or processes, or changing or omitting data or results that would change the accuracy or represent the final outcome. So fabrication is making something up. Falsification is manipulating the data. And plagiarism is using somebody else's work without giving them proper credit. Okay, so those are the definitions that you would want to know. So human subjects. Human subject research is research involving individuals about whom a researcher conducting the research obtains data through an intervention, an interaction with the individual, or identifiable private information. So The intervention is a study, right, where you have an action, or I'm going to say a drug, right, something that changes a potential outcome. An interaction is an interview. If I'm doing a one-on-one verbal interview with someone, that is an interaction and requires, in order for me to ask those questions and have the dialogue, that there be informed consent, right? It may be very easy to get the IRB, to get the informed consent, but it becomes more difficult when our topics become extremely sensitive, or could be traumatizing to individuals. It's easy to have conversations with an individual, that interaction, that talks about, what are your favorite foods? What do you typically like? It becomes more difficult and more important to have your protocols in place when you are talking about a sensitive topic. If you are talking about abuse, if you were talking about something related to sex, anything that could have a traumatic emotional response from your participants would then require different levels of protocols and different levels of consent so that they understand what they're getting into. Identifiable private information. It's one thing to get a dump of data from a hospital that has, let's say, no names, no identifiable information. We had this number of patients. This was their age range. These are the results of their blood work. Okay, that might be unidentifiable. But if you come to realize there are only 6 patients in a particular age range, and only one of them is male, at the end of the day, you can go back and identify an individual. And that wouldn't be acceptable without giving that individual the opportunity, right, to consent to being part of that research study. So again, thinking about where we are involved with an individual, an intervention, a conversation, right, the interaction, or simply data that's identified to one person. So we want to make sure that we're removing ourselves and personal information as we're doing human subject research. Requirements for evaluating ethics of human subject research. Is there social value? Are we going to learn something from it? Is there scientific validity? Is it going to help improve the lives of someone later on? Was there fair subject selection? Did everybody have an equal chance of being selected into that category? And is there a favorable risk-benefit ratio? I think about somebody that's in a study for a significant disease, right? If you have a life-threatening disease and you have exhausted every possible method of solving that, of eliminating that right now, of recovery, then there's a very favorable risk-benefit ratio to a new study. Was there independent review? So that's where we go back to the IRB. Did somebody else take a look at your methodology, at your protocols and your process to ensure that you thought of everything and that you were ethical in the process? There needs to be informed consent. We've talked about that. We need to have respect for the subjects. So our protocols, and our protocols mean the process that we take to administer the questionnaire, the blood draw, the intervention, whatever it is, we're consistent and respectful for every single person that we come in contact with. Informed consent. It's a process, not a form. You don't hand over a piece of paper, say, sign this, and you have consent, right? It needs to have 4 basic requirements. Is the person competent? So do they understand what they're signing? There needs to be full disclosure. They know exactly what could happen. What are the potential outcomes, side effects? Is death a possibility, right? If you've ever gone into a hospital for surgery, it can be the most minor surgery, but your informed consent form will always say if you were going under anesthesia and possibility of death, right? Because it's a small possibility, but you receive full disclosure that that could happen. Part 3, you understand exactly what is being told. I understand that if I go under anesthesia for a whatever removal, right, even though it's only going to be for 20 minutes or half hour or whatnot, that there is a small chance that I might not come out, right? 1%, whatever that is, 0.5%, whatever that is. And it's voluntary. No one is being forced to sign the consent form. They do it because they want to and they are willing to move forward. Again, you can't use prisoners. You need to be very careful about using vulnerable populations when you are doing your research. It has to be voluntary. They have to feel and understand that they make the decision. And again, as part of that informed consent, they always know, and you've established, they can come out, they can choose to end their part of the study at any point. They can stop, right? I'm doing the intervention. It doesn't feel right. I don't like it. I'm done. And you would include that, the number that drop out, your attrition rate, in your final paper. We'll talk about what that looks like later on. All right, here's an example of an informed consent form. You'll find this on the Sac State Research website, so it's available to you. Just an example, talks about having the person's name, the benefits, or the drawbacks to whatever the research might be. Privacy is a big part of ethics. All right, you've heard about HIPAA, Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act of 1996. We don't share private information, period, end of conversation, without the consent of someone else, or the individual, I should say, right? So HIPAA doesn't apply once the individual provides consent, right? I should not be talking to a family member about an individual's health condition without their consent, right? Let alone an outside party. So the standards for privacy and identifiable health information, again, unfortunately, we live in a society, particularly in the United States, that is driven by insurance companies that are there to make money. So it's very important that if somebody has a pre-existing condition, that not be available information to everyone, because that could financially impact them in the future as well as their future health options. So again, we don't share health information without informed consent. So IRBs, institutional review boards. Universities, hospitals, corporations, and other institutions have formal committees that review the research proposal with human subjects before the research begins. So I'm looking at the lit review, the justification for the research. I'm looking very closely at the methodology. Does the methodology create a study that will get me the answers I want based on my research question? And then I'm looking at my protocols. Are the protocols appropriate for keeping the individuals, the population, safe in that research study? That's kind of what the IRB is looking for. There are different levels of IRB depending on the type of research you're doing, right? Administering a survey to a group of nutrition students in a nutrition class would have an instant sign off, right, on an IRB from the college. As a matter of fact, the college or the university may not require an IRB for in-class research assignments, but for a dissertation, especially if you're using human subjects, then an IRB would be required. If you're doing a human research study with a blood draw or with children, it's a much more detailed IRB than, again, going back to I'm administering a survey to nutrition students, right? So that level of potential risk is what's going to determine the extent and difficulty within an IRB. So independent committee, at least 5 members. The purpose is to protect human subjects, especially vulnerable groups such as children, prisoners, pregnant women, people with mental disabilities, or people who are economically or educationally disadvantaged. And the IRB determines whether your research is ethical and safe to carry out. and it may monitor the research depending on the particular organization. So, before starting research activities, including student researchers, you must complete your IRB. So, you file the IRB application with your organization, and then you complete any mandatory training that organization requires. So, for the college, for the university, you can find on their research site information on what is needed for an IRB and the process you would go through. So it requires a detailed description of your planned research, the length of the study, how long is this going to take, what are the risk benefits within this particular study, are there any surveys or questionnaires? And again, they would want to take a look at those to verify, again, that your questions are leading to the outcome answers that will finally give you information about your research question. They're going to want to see any consent forms to make sure those are appropriate and legal. Privacy and confidentiality for participants. What are your protocols? What are you doing? How are you locking up your data? Is it on your computer? Is it locked into a file that no one can access without a particular key code? Like, how are you doing that? In past, before computers, we literally would have talked about literally locking data into a file cabinet and who has access to that file cabinet and who has a key. In modern research, who has access to the computer? Who has access to the files within that computer, right? So that privacy is going to be an issue and a concern. Do you have recruitment materials? What do those look like? So the IRB committee the board is going to be looking at, is the recruitment material designed to bring you the population and the sample size that you need for legitimate research? Are there compensation or benefits, right? We want to talk about how we get participants, and we'll talk in other classes about selecting our participants, but from an ethical standpoint, can I give them something for their time? In some cases, yes, it's perfectly ethical to pay for someone's time, but it shouldn't be so much pay that it should impact their answers. So I'm not paying you hundreds of dollars for an hour's worth of your time, but I might give you a $10 gift card for the inconvenience of coming and talking to me. I might offer a gift card for those that fill out a questionnaire, right? $5 to Starbucks, whatever that is. So we'll talk later on when we talk about trying to get our sample population and get our participants, but there's a level, right? There's something to think about in terms of compensation. Where is that compensation thanking them? And where is a level of compensation that might change their answers? So are we paying for answers? So the IRB, that board, is going to be looking at that. Again, how do you store your data? How do you keep it safe? Budget information. What's it going to cost? Who's paying for it? Is there conflict of interest there? And a detailed description of any secondary data you might use. Right? So all of that is going to be looked at by the IRB. I'm not going to go to the direct link here while I'm in this module, but I encourage you, we can look at it when we're in person if you want to. You can go to the PowerPoint that you have, because you have copies of this PowerPoint in your module for this week, and you can click on this link and it will take you to the Sac State University's IRB process, and you can look at that. And I'm going to want you to look at that later on in the class. For our last paper, you're going to be doing a project proposal, and in your research proposal, you're going to have to tell me, do you need an IRB for this research? So you'll be going to the site later on to take a look at it. So I encourage you, go to the site, take a look at it. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and try and add this link in the module underneath this video for you to take a look at. And then finally, here's the 3 levels of the IRB. exempt reviews. You hand it in, and basically they say, all right, you really don't need us to look at it. Research is established or accepting education in accepted educational settings. It involves the use of surveys, interviews, and observations of public behavior in subjects that cannot be identified. Analysis of previous collected data with no identifiable information. Something that's consumer acceptance about taste or food quality studies, right? Research studies for businesses, consumer studies fall into this category all the time. Why do you like this brand? Why do you like Starbucks? What do you think of our logo, right? Those sorts of things would be an exempted review. Research to study or evaluate public benefits or service programs. Then we have exempted reviews, again, brief. And then we got full reviews, complete reviews. If I am doing a blood draw, if I am working with a vulnerable population, that's going to require a full and complete board review before you get approval. All right. I hope that this helps you. I hope that going through this together in this video really helped to summarize and better understand what Chapter 3 is talking about. All right, have a wonderful week. And as I said, I encourage you to take a look at that IRB requirements for Sac State. Have a great week. I'll see you later.